Hello everyone and welcome to another really awesome game from the third round of the FTX Crypto Cup. It is Praggnanandhaa versus Hans. Chess speaks for itself. Niemann well, a lot has happened in this match so far. This is game 4 of the match. The match started by Hans winning. Then Pragg retaliated with the white pieces in the same variation. They play in game 4, but it's interesting that in game 2 that Pragg won, where he retaliated. All the action in the game was on the queen side, where in this game all the action is on the king side, but from the exact same opening. So that's really wild. And game 3 of course ended in a draw. So if this game ends in a draw, they go into tie breaks. If it doesn't, then whoever wins the match. So let's dive straight into it. It is one of those games that out of nowhere, the entire board just explodes with action. So Pragg has the white pieces, and they basically repeat game 2 that Pragg won. We have d4, knight to f6, we have c4, e6, knight to c3, offering Hans the opportunity to play the Nimzo Indian defense, as Pragg is a big fan of the Nimzo himself. But like in game 2, Niemann goes for the Queen's Gambit decline. The d5, we have c captures, and bishop to g5 now. So the exchange variation, c6 strengthening the d5 pawn, e3, and bishop to f5, made possible due to the exchange on d5. And now Pragg goes after the bishop. We have queen to f3, attacks the bishop, bishop to g6, and now we have a queen trade. Bishop captures, queen captures, and now g captures on f6. And in game 2 that we've discussed, Pragg went for h4, but here he plays knight to f3, which are the two ways basically of treating this position. Both are aimed at going after the light square bishop. Next, Pragg will play knight h4 and harass the bishop a little bit, but not really. You never want to capture this bishop, as it's not a great bishop. You want to play knight h4, f4, f5, and maybe try and trap the bishop. So here, knight to d7, knight to h4, and knight to b6. Now we have pawn to f4, now preparing f5, but this has all been played before, so of course Hans knows how to treat this. We have f5. The bishop is now basically a pawn, but at some point either white will capture, which is good for black, or white will play knight to f3 to try and remaneuver the knight to e5, where you will play f6, deny the knight e5 and g5 squares, and shift the bishop over to f7. So that's how you bring the bishop back to life. We have bishop to d3, and now the tricky knight to c4, attacking e3 and b2, and now you kind of have to capture on c4. So bishop captures and d captures on c4. So similar to what happened in game 2, we have bishops against knights. So the knight pair of Pragg versus the bishop pair of Hans. We have king to f2. And now there is one game in the database where bishop to e7 was played from the 2017 individual European Championship between Lupulescu and Sedlak, but here Lupulescu won. But here we have queenside castles, and it is now, as of move 15, that we have a completely new game. So let's see how Pragg goes about this. We have pawn to a4. You don't want to allow b5 to cement the c4 pawn. Now c4 pawn is a target, and you have this position where white will always be better. Yes, black has the bishop pair, so it's very hard to evaluate this. You want to say white will always be better because you have a doubled c pawn and a doubled f pawn, but the bishop pair, if the bishop pair comes alive, you might even give up a few of those pawns, and it's going to be a tricky position to play. So bishop to e7 attacks the knight, knight to f3, and now what we've discussed, f6, denying the knight, not that, e5 and g5 squares, and the bishop will now be shifted over to f7, maybe to help out with the defense of the c4 pawn. So knight h4, bishop to b4 now. For the moment, you don't worry about this because you actually want white to capture this. So bishop to b4, rook h to c1, now preparing to move the knight and put pressure on the c4 pawn, and the rook h to e8. And here Pragg has to decide. You could capture on g6, for example, captures, and then play knight to d1, and there's no way you can defend the c4 pawn. So that's one way to go about it, but Pragg decides to keep everything in the game, and he wants to win the f5 pawn instead. So he goes knight to d1 right away, attacks the c4 pawn, and now says, okay, you keep your bishops, you can defend with bishop to f7, but then I'm going to take the f5 pawn. And this is again, it's incredibly difficult to evaluate this because it's the bishop pair. So bishop to f7, Pragg captures the f5 pawn, and now pawn to c5. Hans gets rid of the other doubled pawn as well, and now his bishop pair will come alive. So knight h6, attacking the bishop, but now, of course, Hans does not want to give it away. Bishop to e6, pawn to f5, bishop to d5, and now it'd be great if you had e4 and d5, but you don't, so knight to c3. Now you are putting again pressure on this bishop, so bishop to c6, and now rook back to d1. We have captures, and now bishop to a5. Rook to d2, preparing to double up on the d file, or maybe bring the other rook into the game via the e1 square, and now bishop to b6. So if you remember from that position where the bishops weren't all that impressive, now the bishop pair has most certainly come alive. Rook a to d1, Pragg doubles up on the d file, and bishop to e4 now. Very, very nicely done. Going after this bishop to d3 idea, and then if the rooks will not be able to defend the d4 pawn, then you will just win it without any problem. So here, Hans is basically saying you have to capture this bishop, and Pragg believes him. He plays knight captures on e4. I will show just for fun what happens if knight to f7 is played, as this kind of wins the game for white. It's a very, very tricky move. The rook now is hanging, and you don't really have a good way of dealing with this. For example, rook d7 attacks the knight. Now we're going to play rook to e2, and when you play rook captures on f7, rook captures on e4 with your d4 pawn always defended. And now, for example, rook captures, knight captures with the threat of knight to d6 with this beautiful fork, rook to d7, let's say, but now king e3, we defend the pawn. And you have this position where white is up a pawn, and this is in fact a winning position for white. There isn't all that much you can do, and also the f6 pawn is hanging, so it's impossible to hold. It's just g4, h4, g5. The position basically plays itself. So instead, after bishop to e4, Pragg believes Hans. He plays knight captures on e4, rook captures on e4, and now king to f3, chasing away the rook, but now also the d4 pawn falls. So rook captures, we have rook captures, and now, of course, rook to c1. You cannot trade here, because if you trade captures, the b2 pawn will fall. There's no way for you to defend it, and then Hans gets this beautiful passed c pawn. So instead, rook to c1 by Pragg, and now comes rook to d3 check, king to e4, and now rook to d4 check, king f3, rook to d3 check, and Pragg could continue. Hans would most likely agree to a threefold repetition, but Pragg has the white pieces, and before going into tiebreaks, he will try, of course, to push this further. So king g4, rook d2 now attacks the b2 and the g2 pawns, and rook captures on c4 with check. King d7, now comes king to h3. Defending g2 but giving up the b2 pawn. So rook captures, and now Pragg plays knight to g8, goes after the f6 pawn, and while you could defend this, for example, bishop to d8, then we play rook h4 and go after the h7 pawn. So not really a good trade-off. So king d6, Hans says, all right, you go after the f6 pawn. I'm going to play king to e5, attack your knight, then when you move your knight, I'm going to grab the f5 pawn, but Pragg says not so fast. Rook e4, he cuts off the black king from entering the e file. And now, how do you play this? Now the problem is bishop to d8 no longer is an option, because now knight captures on f6 can be played, and if bishop captures, rook here delivers check, king d5, rook captures, and this is now again a winning position for white, and easily winning one. So here, rook to f2. Hans continues in the strongest way possible, and now pawn to g4. And here you can really see that Pragg's position has improved drastically, and that the walls are starting to close in on Hans. So king to c5, we have king to g3, preparing h4 and g5, rook to a2, and now just pawn to h4. The rook here is doing a wonderful job guarding the a4 pawn, and with the bishop on b6, there's no way for black to quickly start advancing his own pawns and create a passed pawn. So bishop to c7 check, king to f3, now bishop to e5, hoping to get some rook a3, rook to g3 action in. but Prague just plays g5. This is the only way to continue playing for the win, as it creates some squares for the white king to use to keep pushing. So rook a3 check, king to g4, and now rook to g3 check. Luckily you have h5, otherwise it would be checkmate. So king to h5, and now we have king to d5, leaving us with this spectacular position that could even be turned into a small study. Not a big one, but maybe a small one. So feel free to pause the video and try to find the only clean winning idea for Prague while I give you a couple of seconds. So for those of you who were able to do this, congratulations, you are a true master of incredibly tricky endgames. And for those of you who just want to enjoy the show, it is knight captures on f6. Of course, all of you thought about this, but after bishop captures, your rook is hanging, so we can't just recapture here. The move to find is rook to b4. Yes, again, the b4 square is involved in the winning of the game, but this is basically what chess is about. It's who who utilizes the b4 square most to his advantage will be the winner of a chess game. I think the entire chess game could be summarized with that idea. But okay, rook b4 here. Now the bishop still hangs, so you have to move it. Bishop e5, now rook captures on b7, and yes, white is down a piece, but the pawns are simply too strong. The h7 pawn will fall, and then the three connected pass pawns are much stronger than a bishop. For example, rook f3 goes after the pawn. Now even rook to f7, you don't even allow black to capture this. And now let's say a5, you're just gonna play pawn to f6. If rook to f4, preventing the king here so you don't lose this, just rook captures on h7, and now the pawns are too powerful. Rook captures here, king to g6, and now the pawns are marching forward. So that's the way to do it, but it is incredibly tricky. Both of them are very low on time. Pragg plays rook to e2. Now he is preparing to capture, and he doesn't want his rook to be under attack here, but now here he allows f captures on g5, h captures on g5, and rook to h3. Hans finds the absolute best way to keep fighting. King g4, rook to g3 check, king to h4, that's not an h4, king to h4 to prevent a perpetual, and now rook to g1. We have knight to f6 check, and here Hans plays king to d6. Beautifully played by Hans, because if you trade here, yes, you double Pragg's pawns, but how are you stopping the passed f pawn? The king cannot get across, and if you try something like this, it doesn't really matter. Just rook e7, and this is winning for white. You're just gonna gobble up everything on the 7th rank. The king goes here, or even here if black allows it. It's a very easy win. So after knight f6 check, king to d6, and now knight to e8 with check. Now the king has to go back to keep defending the bishop. King d5, knight f6 check, king d6, and now knight to e4 check. We have king to d5, and now Pragg plays knight to f2. And this is very tricky. Here to continue fighting, you have to play f6, but Pragg plays knight to f2, and now he allows Hans an opportunity to get back into the game, and Hans seizes it. Rook to g2. Now you have a problem. Bishop g3 check, and what is happening here? You are losing a piece. So here, rook d2 check by Pragg, bishop to d4, now threatening to win the knight, and here Pragg plays knight to e4. And the only way to actually draw this with black is to trade here. Captures, and now play b6, and this position is a draw if played properly, but it looks very scary with white having these pawns here. However, it was the way to go. But here rook to g1 was played, and now Pragg is completely winning, but only if he finds the move that wins the game, and that of course is knight to g3. Now you are blocking the g file, you are also preventing rook to f1, and most importantly, if black plays a silly move, let's say a6, you have an imminent threat. Just rook captures on d4, king captures, and knight to e2 check wins the rook here. So that's it. King e5, knight captures, and yes, black will win this pawn, but a5, and that's it. It's a very easy win for white. So after knight g3, rook to a1, Hans again finds an incredible defensive resource. Knight to e2, now the bishop is lost. But however, king to e5, saying if you capture with the rook, I'm just gonna capture on f5, and I still have fighting chances. But here, knight captures on d4, now defends the f5 pawn, and Hans plays not that. Rook captures on a4. Now the knight cannot move as the king is also on the 4th rank. So now Hans will seemingly win back the piece, but Pragg says, Nope. Pawn to f6, and you don't have a way of capturing, because if you trade, the pawn is simply too strong. f7, the pawn queens, and that's it. So instead, Hans played rook to a1, but now knight to f3 with check, king e6, rook to e2 with check, king f7, and here rook to e7 check, and he was in this position on move 64. I always enjoy it when games end on move 64. That Hans Moke Niemann resigned the game, as there is nothing more to be done here. Once he moves, for example, king f8, doesn't really matter where, just a 95, and now once this check lands, that's it. You can even give up a pawn for this. For example, rook check, king g3, rook g1 check, king f2. You give up the g5 pawn, still this is just winning. King goes here, you have to deliver a check. King goes here, now a discovery from the rook. The queen delivers check, the knight defends the queen, and now it's a very, very quick checkmate. Nothing to be done here. So really beautifully done by both of them. This game was, I mean, it was so beautifully played by both of them. Hans kept finding incredible resources, and the Prag missed a clean win a few times. But it's rapid chess, of course, it will happen. But that only makes the game, more interesting. And you never know who will win, because it's rapid. People just blunder stuff. But yeah, this was truly. Immaculate play by both of them. But yeah, very close by Hans, who still is without a win in this event, and Prag now the only player alongside Magnus Carlsen with 3 match wins this event. Okay, here's a nice graphic from Chess24 if you guys want to check it out. There you have it. So Magnus and Prag, only 2 players with 9 points, as you get 3 points for a win in the match. Then we have with 5 points Aronian and Firuja, who also won his match yesterday against Anish Giri. It was really a wild one. They drew all of their 4 rapid games. Then I believe they drew the Blitz games, and then Alireza won the Armageddon. Duda with 4 points, Liam Lea with 3, Anish Giri with 1, and Hans Moke Niemann with 0 points so far. So we'll see what happens. Everyone, of course, is waiting for the clash between Magnus and Praggnanandhaa, but that will only come in round 5. In round 4, Magnus will be facing Liam Le, and of course Praggnanandhaa will be facing Levon Aronian. So we'll see if they will be able to continue pushing with with this strength of just crushing everyone and winning every match. So yeah, brilliantly done by Prag. Really looking forward to his next match, as it is against Aronian. So anything, if he beats Aronian and then goes fight Magnus with a perfect score, I think the entire internet will explode. But yeah, that's the game and the match. Hope you guys enjoyed it. I would like to wish a very happy birthday to Jonathan Latti, and I would like to thank Brandon Ward, Johan Clayson, Raymond Raphael, and Buntiak Pang for a contribution to my channel. Thank you a lot. I really appreciate it. As usual, you can check 2 of my previous videos here. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you soon, continuing the coverage of the FTX Crypto Cup until it finishes. Thank you all. I will see you soon, and have an excellent rest of your day.